Well, folks, it's time to turn to the dark side a little bit here of medical research. Today we're going to talk about fraud. So the goals here are to remind you that everything we've learned so far is built on trust. We have to trust that the authors are accurately reporting what they did. We have to trust that they're giving you the correct numbers, and to realize that mechanisms to root out fraud are actually relatively poor. But since we're talking about trust, and I feel like over the course of these lectures, we've built a certain trust between all of us. You trust me, I want to let you in on a really great deal that very few people have the option to do. Only people who take this course have the opportunity to get Professor Perry's money crystal. It's really exciting opportunity for you. In fact, you can see our original article published here. You guys know how to read medical articles now. New England Journal of Medicine, published in 2020. Okay, it's going to be published, in about a year or so. What we did is we took 10,000 average people just like you and me, and we randomized them to get my money crystal or not, and look at these results. The people who got the crystal had an average increase in income of $6,000 compared to just $430 in the people who got a placebo crystal, which, obviously isn't going to work at all. And the p-value is less than 0.00001. I mean, this evidence is incredible. It's scientifically proven. We could say that the study is rock solid. And today, for you, you can get my money crystal for just $29.99. That's right, $29.99 gets you an average increased income of $6,000, scientifically proven. After taking this course, you should know what a good study looks like, and this is a perfect one. So you can send your checks to the address at the bottom of the lecture. Okay. That was fraud. I lied to you a little bit there. I lied to you about my study because I wanted your money, and I just don't want to keep going forward with this sort of rupture in our relationship. But there are reasons why people commit fraud in medical research, and that is one of them. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of other places where fraud has been committed. So here's an interesting one. Does prayer influence the success of in vitro fertilization? So the idea in this randomized trial, as it was reported at least, is that women who are undergoing IVF would be randomized to have a prayer group pray for them or not. Now, if you read this study, you can see the methods are quite good. They were blinded, so the women didn't know they were being prayed for. The prayer group apparently only got a picture of the woman, so they couldn't track her down and give her milkshakes or anything like that to increase the rates of in vitro fertilization. It was kind of a well-designed study, and had 200 people in it, allocation concealed. Everything was done quite well, and what you can see here in the results in the right part of the screen is that the pregnancy rate was about 55% in the prayer group compared to 30 or so percent in the control group. So this is a substantial effect, essentially proving the efficacy of prayer for a really important hard outcome, right, which is pregnancy. So that's great. Do we just take this at face value? Well, the New York Times did. So this is an article appearing in the New York Times talking about the study. And they point out that this was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and the lead author was the chief of obstetrics and gynecology at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, a fine medical school of which I attended. And this was sort of a big deal until people investigated a little bit more and discovered that this article was written largely by the man listed as the second author, Daniel Wirth, who had a master's degree in parapsychology from the John F. Kennedy University in Orinda, California. His alias, and this is true, was John Wayne Truelove, which is the best alias in the world. And in 2004, after this was published, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for various crimes, including 13 counts of mail fraud, 12 counts of interstate transportation of stolen money, making false statements on loan applications, and 5 other counts of fraud. He also collected over $100,000 from his deceased father's Social Security checks. And search for his name. You'll find multiple publications on the efficacy of prayer and therapeutic touch. and stuff like this. This study, it turns out, didn't exist. The 199 women were fake and made up. There was no prayer group. Everything was just fabricated whole cloth and typed up. Why? Not for money, I don't think. I think this was just notoriety, fame. He was just a bit of a shyster. It speaks to a major problem with peer-reviewed research, is that all you get is the paper. You don't get to meet the people who are in the study. You just read the paper. You say, well, the methods seem good. It is built on trust. And obviously, people can violate this trust. Now, that story was a little funny to me. You know, no one was really harmed except, I guess, the reputation of the other authors and this journal. But fraud can go in very bad ways. So this study was called Ileolymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia Nonspecific Colitis and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children, which shouldn't make much sense to anyone. But the lead author, Andrew Wakefield, you may have heard of before. So this was the study published in The Lancet in 1998 that purported to link the MMR vaccine to autism, starting a whole series of events that have hurt countless people around the globe. The study itself you can still read, although it's been retracted. It reported on 12 children who apparently were healthy and happy before they got the MMR vaccine. But then, according to the study, 1 to 2 weeks later, they developed diarrhea and regression, and they all ended up being severely developmentally delayed. The study was pretty thorough. They actually did biopsies, or they reported on biopsies of intestinal tissue. One thing that was a little suspicious is that Wakefield himself held a press conference about the results of this study before they were peer-reviewed and published, which is a little unorthodox, but I suppose you could make an argument that, you know, he wanted to get this information out as soon as possible. So what actually happened? Well, in reality, behind the scenes, Wakefield had been creating a business that would market tests to support litigation against vaccine manufacturers. He was hoping that people with kids who had autism could take his blood test and that would confirm the link to the vaccine, and then the people could sue the vaccine manufacturers. Apparently, he told a colleague he anticipated a revenue stream of $43 million per year from this venture. That is a pretty hefty inducement to fabricate some results. But what happened to these 12 children? Well, it took some really intrepid reporters to actually track them down, and what they found was fairly startling. Only 1 out of the 12 children actually had autism. Only 3 out of the 12 had nonspecific colitis. 0 out of the 12 had medical record evidence of emergence of symptoms in the days to weeks following the MMR vaccination. That was entirely fabricated. The study was subsequently retracted, with The Lancet saying the study was commissioned and funded for planned litigation. Now, it was retracted 12 years after the initial publication, after quite a bit of damage was done. So the motivation here was to build a company that was going to make millions and millions of dollars. And they told the story in this study that turned out not to be true. But if you just read the study, there's no way to know that for sure. Now, fraud can take many forms. There's outright fabrication, like the examples I gave to you, but there's also falsification, which is the willful distortion of results. You know, you did the study, but you sort of push things around, change things a little bit. Plagiarism is a form of fraud. I think obscuring or omitting relevant data can also be considered fraud, right? You don't tell people a relevant side effect of the drug. You only report on its efficacy. Redundant publication. So I take the same study and I kind of rewrite it and I publish it in a couple different journals. I would consider that fraud. Things exist on a spectrum, and there's many more sort of academic dishonesty in this world. Now, how do we figure it out? How do we know that a study is a fraud? So there are some statistical approaches that can look at the numbers in a study and make a determination through math to say, you know, these numbers look kind of too good or too bad or too uniform. They don't look like the kind of numbers you see in a study that was real. And more journals are going to be using these techniques, but it is by no means common. In fact, the vast majority of studies do not undergo that kind of statistical review. The most important tip when you're thinking about fraud is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If they're saying something amazing, like prayer doubles the rate of pregnancy, that's an incredible statement. Regardless of what they write in the paper, regardless of how rigorous their methods are, just that statement requires a ton of evidence. One single study, especially from one single research group, is almost never enough to change practice. So a lot of times with these studies that turn out to be fraud, we would have been fine if we just waited for one other research group to confirm the results before we all got worked up about the original results that were shown. So what about large multi-center studies, right? Not small studies in single research groups. What about large multi-center studies? Are they safe? Well, not necessarily. Fraud occurs in large, industry-sponsored studies, but it often takes different forms. You're not going to get a study that is made up whole cloth. Merck is not going to create 10,000 fake individuals from multiple different sites and input the data completely fraudulently like someone might in a single center study. It's just not possible. There's too many different people working on it. Those kind of conspiracies are very hard to make work. And the risks to them are just so incredibly high. But what might happen is suppression of data. So you remember when Merck took Vioxx off the shelves because there emerged evidence that they had knowledge that Vioxx might be increasing the rates of certain heart conditions, and they didn't publish it. So that's the kind of fraud that you might see in these big industry-sponsored studies, sort of fraud by omission instead of fraud by commission. I have a personal concern about foreign study sites. So a lot of studies are now occurring, all over the world, and we don't know that good research practices are in place in all of these sites, as they often are in places in the United States. And there's a lot of incentives, especially for industry-sponsored studies, to enroll patients at your site, because they pay per patient, sometimes $5, $10, $15, $20,000 to enroll a single patient in your study. So if you're some research center somewhere in the world and you need money, are you likely to potentially enroll a patient that maybe doesn't quite meet the inclusion or exclusion criteria? Maybe you list their age as being 46 instead of 44 because the study excludes people who are under age 45 or something like that. Not too much research into this, but it is something I'm certainly worried about. If you look at the numbers, 65% of FDA-regulated trials are conducted outside of the United States. That's FDA-regulated trial. And surprisingly, a third of phase 3 trials from the 20 biggest pharma companies are conducted entirely outside the United States. Our ability to audit sites outside of the US is quite limited. So what do you do about this? Lots of studies are going to be multi-center and be global. And that's important because we don't just care if medicines are good for Americans, we care if they're good for everyone. One really important thing is that individual sites are compared in terms of the efficacy of the intervention. They should all be roughly similar. If you see one site where everyone is doing amazing on the drug, and that does not seem to be borne out throughout all the other sites, well, then that site might need to be looked at to make sure that everything is on the up and up. So the papers that are multi-center should report somewhere how heterogeneous, how different the overall results are by study site or study country. This is just a map to show you where a lot of the clinical trials are happening around the world, and of course you can see that they happen all over the place. So the take-home points is that unfortunately fraud does occur in medical research. These big splashy cases are probably the tip of the iceberg. There's probably a lot of fraud that goes under the surface. Maybe not outright fabrication of data, but mild bits of changing data here and there. Certainly something to worry about. There is no way to be 100% certain a study is fraud-free. You just can't tell. The whole system is built on trust, which is why independent replication is so crucial. And you really should think about not believing a study at all until it's independently replicated, particularly if something looks too good to be true. Because if it looks too good to be true, it may not be true. Thanks a lot.